Thank you for joining me today. My name is Emily Johnson, and I'm going to be talking to you about my thesis research, which is on the archaeological applications for the identification of nixtamalized maize starch granules, which is quite a mouthful, so we're going to break that down a little bit. Nixtamalization is a specific cooking process that I'm focused on in my research, and it's the process of cooking a dried maize kernel in an alkaline or a basic solution until the kernel is tender and ready to be eaten. And this process occurs throughout the Americas, primarily in the southeast United States, the southwest United States, as well as throughout Mesoamerica. The earliest evidence for this practice is found between 1200 and 1500 BC, primarily in Mexico and in Guatemala, although this is a practice that is still continuing today. It's actually the practice that is responsible for creating the dough for tortillas and tamales. So even if you're not familiar with the term nixtamalization specifically, you do come into contact with the byproducts of this process in your everyday life. So as you can imagine, this is an incredibly important process in the daily lives and in the foodways of the people who live in these regions. Now, what is starch exactly? It's exactly what you think. People and plants both use it for energy. It's in all of the yummy foods we like to eat, like pasta and potatoes and bread. And archaeologically, we tend to recover it in two primary ways. And this is in dental calculus, which is essentially fossilized plaque. So if you ever wanted a reason to floss your teeth, there you go. And also in residue from cooking ware. So we'll sample the inside of a pot for the burned or encrusted food remains to examine what people might have been cooking and eating in those pots. And because it is a microscopic form of a botanical remain, we tend to use two kinds of light to examine it when we're looking at it under the microscope. And these are plane and cross-polarized light. So plain light is what you would expect to see when you're looking through a microscope, whereas polarized light allows us to apply a filter that allows us to see different aspects of the starch grain. So you can see in the second image below, it applies the light blue color and allows us to see the cross in the center of the starch grain. So nixtamalization in archaeology has to be identified using proxies, such as the cooking artifacts people use to process the corn. So these tend to be grinding stones. You can see the woman on the right here is using a mano, which is a hand grinder, and a metate, which is the base that she's grinding against, to actually grind the maize to form dough for tortillas and tamales. And these tend to be cooked on large griddles known as comals, which is in the image below. So there is no way to directly identify this process in the archaeological record. So if we don't have these kinds of artifacts left behind, it's difficult for us to say whether this practice is occurring at all. And this is especially problematic when you're looking at those older sites and older timelines, trying to establish whether this practice was occurring or not. And it's especially problematic having to rely on these proxies because this is such an important and long-lasting process in this region. It's an especially important cooking process because it helps to prevent diseases that stem from malnutrition. Maize, when it's used as the staple food in the diet, can cause problems because it is naturally deficient in vitamin B3 or niacin. So this cooking process actually helps to correct that deficiency by allowing the bound niacin in the corn to be absorbed by the body. So as you can imagine, this is culturally an incredibly important aspect of the daily lives of the people in this region. And it's, again, problematic that we can't identify this process and its origins throughout time by directly identifying its remains. So why am I choosing to look at this microscopic starch as opposed to these larger organic remains, maybe the kernels themselves or evidence of the tortillas or the tamale dough? And this is primarily because in the climates of the Americas, it's very hot, humid, and there's a lot of acidic soils. And this means that the larger organic or botanical remains tend not to be preserved. So we have to go to a different level of analysis and microscopic level of evidence. And how I'm actually going to use the starch to try and identify this cooking process. So I'm going to look for characteristic and diagnostic damage that occurs to the starch grains as they go throughout this cooking process. So you can imagine At the beginning, you have your dried maize. You have a very perfect looking starch grain. As it goes through this process, it looks very different coming out the other side. So I'm primarily looking at the end process and product of the starch grain to see what the damage is. And this is not a new methodology. Previous work has been done trying to identify cooking damage via starch grains. And these have tended to focus on grains such as wheat, barley, and oats, very common in the Near and Middle East, and the different processes that would occur to those. So baking, popping, fermenting, etc. So my research is fairly novel in that little work has been done to try and identify cooking processes that have applied to maize in general. And there's been no work done aiming to identify damage that occurs to starch grains from this process of nixtamalization. So my research was really aimed at looking at whether or not we see specific damage from this process. And if I do see diagnostic damage, is it unique enough and consistent enough to be considered, I guess, attached to this cooking process? Or is it something that we could confuse with baking or popping or fermenting? So my research design, I primarily came up with my recipe for cooking the maize by looking at a whole host of different ethnographic and modern sources for how people prepared their nixtamalized maize. So I first created my alkaline solution, which is the key ingredient of nixtamalization, by combining ordinary pickling lime with water, letting that steep for 5 hours, and then adding dried maize that I soaked for an additional 14 hours in the same solution. I then added that to a crock pot and cooked it on a low-slow heat for 7 hours. I did 2 additional experimental trials where I soaked the maize for an extended period of time in this alkaline solution and also boiled it in the alkaline solution as well to examine variables of heat and absorption of solution on the starch grains. I prepared control trials as well that were not prepared in alkaline but in neutral or normal water. So my control results, you can again see this cross-polarized image of starch on the top and plain starch on the bottom. A and C here are what you would expect from a normal maize starch granule. This is what we see described in the literature for unaltered maize starch. B and D is a maize starch grain that has been boiled in non-alkaline water. And again, it's what we see described in the literature. So fairly typical results there. What was not expected is what I saw when I looked at my nixtamalized maize starch, or starch that had been in an alkaline solution. The primary change that I saw was a color change. So you can see here lots of yellow and purple, none of that light blue that we expect to see for typical maize starch. So we also see a lot of green, bands of orange, again, rings of purple on the outside, and some more light blue. The shape change that we see, instead of the kind of angular polygon we expect to see from maize starch, we see an expanded, much more circular and evenly, I guess again, circular maize starch granule. We don't see a lot of variation. Another characteristic feature that I noticed was a fissure or a crack in the starch grain that occurs as it's cooking. In A and B, these 2 sets of images here, you can see, it's a little bit hard to tell, but the arrow in A is pointing to it, a crack that extends from the center of the starch grain to the outer edge of the starch grain. And in images C and F here, you can see what I call a perpendicular fissure, which is one that runs through the entire length of the grain and cuts through that X or extinction cross in the center of the starch grain. So the results that I found were ones that I didn't see in any of the other literature that had been described for any kind of cooking process, looking at maize or not. And I noticed none of these features in any of my control samples. So implications for my research. This project suggests that it is now possible to identify the process of nixtamalization directly in the archaeological record. So we don't have to rely on these, the proxies of the cooking materials. We can take a pot and sample it and see whether or not people are practicing nixtamalization or not. And this is really important in that it will allow us to refine our data and increase the resolution by tracing the origins, development, and spread of this really vital cooking technology in this region. Perhaps most importantly, my project is really also aimed at creating a source of comparative images. So these are really important in kind of any archaeological work, but especially botanical work and microscopic work where you need a set of comparative images to refer your unknowns against, or else it's really hard to identify or explain what you're seeing in your sample. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be adding these images to an online open source database that will allow researchers from all over the world to compare their samples to my images. So we can kind of continue this conversation over maize starch and the research associated with it, and continue to expand our knowledge of this really important cooking practice. So thank you to everyone who made this possible, and I'll take any questions you have. Yeah.
Is this process what the word tamale comes from?
It is, actually, yeah. So the original root of the word is Aztec in origin, from nixtamal or nixtamale. So you're correct in that tamale is descended from the word for the dough. Yeah, that creates it. Good question.
If you're going to take a guess, like where else in the world this process might have been used besides for the Americas, what would you think?
Yeah, there's some evidence that in China, people were practicing this process of cooking in an alkaline solution with a grain known as sorghum. So it would be interesting to kind of expand this methodology and this research to see if you see similar effects in other grains or even in other kinds of maize, because there are so many different varieties. So yeah, definitely there's ways to expand this to other areas of the world, for sure.
Do you have any plans to continue this research on different grains in the coming future, or are you waiting to see kind of how this is accepted before you choose another species to target?
I would say a little bit of both. It's going to be interesting to see what others who are more experienced with this kind of research have to say about my results, whether it's expected, whether I'm seeing something kind of really odd, and how little, or I guess more work does need to be done to see what different variables have an effect on my results. For example, a lot of the alkalizing agents aren't pickling lime, but things like wood ash and burned plant material. So it'd be interesting to see how those changes also affect what you see in the starch grains. So there's a lot of work to still be done, definitely. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming today. I appreciate it.